Okay, welcome everyone. We're ready to start. This is the fourth session on a special seminar series on the impact of the war in Ukraine on the European Union. It's the fourth of seven seminars that we have created until the end of June. They always take place on Wednesday at this time. And today's session is on security policy and European defense. So EU defense spending, NATO enlargement, Danish referendum alliances, overlap between European Union and NATO, and ultimately about European integration in this area. Today's session is introduced by Stefanie Hofmann and Dietlind Stolle. Thank you very much for introducing the session. We are again in hybrid mode. Thank you very much also those online for joining us. We will start with your presentations and then we go straight to Q&A. We will alternate questions between the audience in the room and the audience online, as we always do. So thank you again, and the floor is yours. I think the screen is all set.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Daniele, and we will alternate between German accents, talking about European security after the invasion. Am I too far away? No. So the way we want to address this topic a little bit is by looking into different issues that have been raised with the illegal invasion of Ukraine by Russia, by looking at different issues and different institutions and how they reacted to this. And by doing this, I mean, we heard last week that some of these issues are being politicized, right? So our argument here, our implicit argument at least, is that we cannot only look into what the elites are doing, but we also have to look into what the public is thinking. So this is how the presentation is actually organized. And so what we want to do is answer, or preliminary answer, a few questions. One of the questions is, or the first question is whether, and now, sorry, I'm going to read from here and then I need my glasses. So what kind of capacities have actually been mobilized, in particular at the European Union level? Then a second part is looking more into NATO and what the implications are for NATO. Thirdly, we actually briefly will talk about the liberal world order in form of the UN, before we then speculate a little bit onto the future of security at large and Ukraine's future in particular. So let's start with our first argument to answer our question, which is that actually Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine has made the EU more capable, but not necessarily more willing, right? So what do we mean by this? Let's look first actually at the public level.
I should say I'm not a IR scholar or foreign policy scholar, but look at this invasion of Ukraine more from a domestic and public perspective. So we start by giving an overview of how the public views the war and aid to Ukraine in EU countries. And the measures come from a very recent survey that has been already mentioned last time, the so-called YouGov survey that is being conducted annually, and this time was conducted in April 2020. And we ask people in 16 countries and the UK about some measures of aid towards Ukraine. And the short message is that generally there is a high willingness to help Ukraine, but it depends on what help is discussed exactly, and it depends on countries or which countries we are talking about. Then by showing the divergence between countries, we also discuss certain hypotheses of why these countries differ on their projected aid for Ukraine. And we consider the distance from Russia, pro-Russian attitudes before the war, consumption of Russian misinformation, obviously oil, gas dependency, systemic distrust, and ideological polarization. And so for the next slide, I actually want to do something a little more fancy, and I think I might need some help. So first I need to go out of the, not end slideshow, but stop the sharing, right? I just don't see the sharing button. Ah, yeah. Okay.
Share screen again. This. There we go. Yeah.
Okay, all right. Okay, so this is also, I also need my glasses, but it's actually not so bad. Okay, so here you see our different questions that we have asked, and you see that there is fairly strong support. So the red dots, the larger red dots are the country means of these 17 countries that we have asked. Okay, so you see very much support for sending humanitarian aid, of accepting refugees, of letting refugees access the labor market. So these percentages go from 86, 81 to 72 on the labor market. But it seems more difficult for Europeans to envision sending their own troops, which is the last item, right? Which is clearly the case that this is the hardest. Only 31, but still 31% across these countries support it. And similarly, there's less than majority support of Europeans to accept higher energy costs, which is very significant, we believe, as it has to do with the sanctions. Though fast tracking the Ukraine to EU membership is also kind of on the edge, it's on 50%. There is slightly more support for sending weapons and military aid. So this graph lets us also see some of the laggards. So for example, you see here Bulgaria is always on the lower end. Also Italy would be in this kind of side or below average, Slovakia as well. Then Germany, so here's Italy, for example. So you see it is often below average, but particularly low for sending weapons. And here we see the front runners, so to say. So Finland is on the highest end of support, almost across all items. And with a little bit less support, there is Spain. Spain as well. And we do see also Poland on the front, and Sweden. So these are our front runners, also together with the UK, although I can't find it right now. So yeah, so this is kind of our overview. So I go back to, when I go over there and go back. Oh, the last, this one? No, but that would be the beginning of the presentation. Okay. So I go, no, wait, isn't it this one? Yeah. Okay, perfect. Okay. Oh, okay, so that, yeah, okay, all right. So you want the overview of how countries react to the Ukraine crisis, okay? So now we're going to look at some factors that explain it. So last time, as you've heard, there was a lot of discussion about the distance from Russia here. So here we measured the distance between the capitals, but we also highlight here 4 countries that share a border with Russia. And Sweden shares only a sea border, but the other 2 share an actual land border. And you see that there is definitely high support in these countries, but it is not a fully explanatory variable. The relationship really goes all over the place if we take the larger distance into account. And even some other countries that don't share a border also have higher support. So it is explaining something, but it is not really a strong explanatory factor. We also look at Russian attitudes, and actually also an item here on Putin before the war. So this should just say it's a Pew research from 2020, not 22. There's a mistake on the slide. So it's a Pew research that we merged with our survey. And as you can see here, there is some sort of historical continuity here. The countries that have a very positive view of Russia in 2020 are also the ones who want to give the lowest aid to Ukraine. And the relationship is actually quite strong. And that is also true for the view of Putin. So we could ask, so why is that the case, right? That's kind of a question, kind of going back even farther. This is not a causal factor in itself. And of course, there needs to be more research into these historical relationships, but we believe it has to do with the fact whether Russia invaded the country itself or not, whether there has been military connections of occupying parts of the country, and whether there are also religious cultural ties. So for example, we also see that the 3 Orthodox countries in our sample are scoring lower on support for Ukraine than non-Orthodox countries. So in general, the closeness to Russia historically does seem to matter quite a bit on how countries align their public support today. Now, we also thought that Russian misinformation matters. As we all know, there is a huge Russian disinformation campaign going on, and that we also see in other countries, not just within Russia. And they are being adopted to different levels. So ideally, we would see, how social media reflect this disinformation, how many tweets are being repeated, although Twitter is, of course, a very elitist kind of instrument. There could be other social media also being checked for disinformation forwarding. Now, we have a second best indicator here. We have a survey question about who is responsible for the war in Ukraine. And these are the people who believe that it is NATO that is mostly responsible or fully responsible for the war. And we see a very strong relationship here at the aggregate level, and it holds also at the individual level, where countries that have a very high percentage of people believing this are also the ones who give less aid. Now, we think it is a measure of misinformation. There's also another argument to be made that it's also a form of anti-Americanism, right? And an argument that has been propelled by some IR scholars who will visit soon, and also by some anti-Americanism discourse that we see in the media. So we cannot totally separate these two here, but we want to propose that as a potential form of misinformation. Our next investigation is probing into the oil and gas dependency in Russia. And for our overall indicator of aid to Ukraine, all these items that I showed you before, we don't see a very strong, and we don't see at all a significant relationship. The gas dependency goes in the right direction, more gas dependency, less aid, but it is not at all significant, also disappears in larger analysis. So the dependency on Russia for energy resources is not our most important explanatory variable here. Finally, we move closer to governmental issues. So we measure here the trust in mainstream institutions. Our idea here is that strong systemic disaffection and rallying against mainstream politics is what disorients people from focusing on aid to Ukraine and supporting Ukraine. And the overall relationship, as you can see, is fairly strong. It's at 0.6. It also explains some of the differences between Eastern European countries, the ones that have higher trust levels in the institutions of the EU and their own government. So mainstream institutions are also more supportive, and the ones who have less trust are much less supportive. This is a factor that holds very much at the individual level. Two more slides here on our divergence of support for Ukraine aid. Here, and I realize with these small screens, this is really hard to see, but we want to make a distinction here between the polarization between supporters of the incumbents in the country and supporters of the opposition, and whether there is a polarization on the Ukraine issue going on. And we ordered this by the overall mean support. And you see, with the exceptions of Lithuania, there is much more convergence between the opposition and the government parties. in these high support countries. But when we go down where we find overall lower support, we see that incumbency supporters and opposition supporters diverge much more. And in some cases, the support also reverses. So, for example, in Hungary, obviously, we see that the opposition is more supportive than the incumbency. But generally, there are more gaps, with the exception of Bulgaria, where there is actually a divergence within the government between opposition and government parties in low support countries. And finally, we show you here the ideological placement and support for Ukraine. Last time, I think our colleagues spoke also about the curvilinear relationship that we see, although the dependent variable there was quite different. But here we have the overall support for Ukraine again. Again, in high support countries, we see much less divergence on whether people place themselves on the left and right. Okay, so there's much more, playing around the mean there, depending on whether you are at the extreme or right or left in the high support countries, although there are some interesting differences. So Lithuania, we already pointed out before, in the United Kingdom, in Germany, in the Netherlands, in Hungary, and in France, we do see that the people who place themselves to the right are much less supportive for aid of Ukraine. And in general, and this also holds in a multivariate regression, the people who place themselves on the left of the spectrum are generally more supportive. There are exceptions, as you can see. So for example, in Italy, the Netherlands, and Lithuania in particular, we do see that the left is less supportive, but overall in our sample, the left is more supportive than the right at the individual level, how people place themselves. Okay, so to summarize where the public stands, we see overall high support for humanitarian aid and acceptance of refugees. We see much more heterogeneity when it comes to sending weapons, accepting Ukraine as an EU member, and accepting higher prices for oil and gas, and sending, of course, your own troops. And the diversity is really explained, or related, I should say, to misinformation, to historical Russian ties, to sharing a border, to overall trust, but less so on gas and oil dependency, but also to some items of polarization.
So let's look a little bit what happened on the elite level. And let me maybe just very briefly talk about two acronyms that people who work on EU foreign security policy know, but others who work maybe not on these issues often are surprised by it, given that the EU actually engages in foreign security and defense policy. And at least while I was writing my dissertation, I had to insist on this, even though the efforts were maybe, and still are, relatively small compared to what's going on in NATO. So what we have in the European Union is the common foreign security policy, which has been included to the EU treaties with the Maastricht Treaty. And here we have what was formerly called the second pillar of the EU. So many instruments have been created here. One of the big ones, and Jan knows much more about it than I, is sanctions, for example. And then within the common foreign security policy, we have a particular policy called the Common Security and Defense Policy, which was created in 1999. It used to be called European Security and Defense Policy. So if you see ESDP as an acronym, it's the same thing. It's not two different policy institutions, but the EU likes to change acronyms once in a while. And so here we have an instrument with which the EU can actually engage in civilian and military operations abroad, outside its borders. NATO would call this out of area operations. And so in particular, CFSP has been activated when it comes to in reaction of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So as I already mentioned, sanctions are one main activity that have happened, where now have just passed the 6th sanction package, even though the negotiations were pretty tough. And as we could see, Hungary in the end actually got concessions, as in not having to comply with the package in an initial phase. We also have an airspace ban, which actually became very well known just a couple of days ago when Lavrov was trying to fly to Serbia, but then was denied flying over EU airspace. So that did not work out. And then in our interactive fashion, Dietlind will actually talk about the protection scheme.
Yes, so the Council adopted anonymously enlarge the temporary protection scheme for Ukrainian refugees. That was a very swift decision. And it's an emergency mechanism that is supposed to alleviate the pressure on the system. And the objective is to allow displaced persons to enjoy a harmonized policy across the EU. So also that includes, it comes with rights that include residence, access to the labor market, and housing, medical assistance, access to education for children. So this policy enjoys high support, as we just heard, in the population for now, although Russian disinformation campaigns are right now trying to persuade, for example, the Polish audiences that in these host countries, that it's a bad deal for them. So there is some sort of attempt to put some sort of doubt into this measure. As a reminder, there are 8 million displaced Ukrainians that have moved abroad. Not all of them have requested under this temporary protection scheme, and 7 million Ukrainians have been displaced internally.
What we also could observe on the EU level is enlargement discussions, right? I mean, for example, the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has said that she would favor Ukraine joining the European Union. The European Parliament has done so as well, major parties therein. But we also have seen people like the French president already suggesting other kind of schemes for the moment as to how to attach Ukraine to the European Union. So I think what we can see is that there's no unity there. And then also there's no one position right now on what kind of track Ukraine would be on, a fast track, or as Letta said, a track that would then lead to Ukraine membership until 2036. So all of this is pretty up in the open, but given that we see divisions across EU member states, at least I'm a pessimist that this is actually going to work in the end. If you want to be a little cynical, something we don't have on the slide is what we can also observe is that West's planning has temporarily halted in the European Union. Actually, Central and Eastern European countries are much more listened to, are not being called irrational and Russia averse at the moment, but instead leading and initiating lots of these items on the EU level. And last but not least, the EU has purchased lethal weapons that have been sent to the Ukraine. And it's that item that I want to briefly talk a bit more, even though, sorry, I'm pointing to people in the room because I know you know it much more. So Jan knows much more about sanctions, Simona knows much more about security assistance than me. But let's briefly talk about what's happening within the European Union. So the EU actually already, as I mentioned, with the common foreign security policy, had various instruments as to engage in security policy, in foreign policy. One of them was the African Peace Facility that was created in 2004 and had over time, over a long period of time, provided up to 3 billion euros to the African Union that then the African Union could use to invest in its African peace and security architecture. So that was happening on the AU level, the continental level, but also the subcontinental level, money that was dispersed to organizations such as ECOWAS, SADC, or IGAD. All of this to say this kind of instrument has ceased to exist before the 2022 invasion, and instead, based on an initiative by the High Representative and Vice President of the Commission in 2018, had pushed for a European peace facility. So this was now an instrument that was not only being used, or should not only be used for the African continent, even though mainly still so. That was the initial or the motivation in 2021, but could also now buy lethal weapons for whoever would request those. Initially, this facility was supposed to have a little more than 5 billion euros available for the time period of 2021 to 2027. Well, since the invasion, this European Peace Facility has been used a few times. Up to now, has already spent 2 billion euros on the purchase of non-lethal and lethal weapons for Ukraine. And this is done, by the way, as an off-budget financing mechanism. It is so because that has not changed within the EU. The EU treaties foresee that its budget cannot be used for military activity. So it has to use an off-budget instrument to do so. And there's no discussion to really change this. So that money that was foreseen for a different continent has now heavily been invested in Ukraine. Moving on. On the national level, what kind of differences or what kind of reactions do we observe here? Well, first and foremost, it is an increase, or at least the announcement of increasing defense spending in different countries. So in particular, Germany, Belgium, Romania, Italy, Poland, Sweden, and the Netherlands have announced that they're going to increase their defense budget. And of course, I think we all have heard this term Zeitenwende, which the German chancellor at the time, just a few days after the invasion, has given a speech and coined this term in the German parliament. So the announcement here was from the German side to have a Sondervermögen of 100 billion euros that should be spent for the defense sector, and then also to increase its military budget to the defense budget to 2%. So this sounds pretty impressive. But let me give you a little but, or maybe several buts, if I may. So first of all, the German military forces had a very bad reputation for the last 10 to 15 years. Various evaluations have been made where then we have observed that it could not even give enough military uniforms to its forces when they were on military exercise in the Baltic. So there were guns that didn't shoot straight. All of this to say, equipment and procurement were already very heavily known as something that was underfunded. Second of all, many promises had been made already of weapon purchases that are now being bought with these hundreds of billions. So we talk about helicopters, but we also talk about fighter jets. So this announcement of buying 35 F-35 stealth jets or to buy 15 Eurofighters, that was already in the making, but are now being paid with this 100 billion that Germany has or will put aside because the parliament still has to pass it completely. So all of this to say, it's a lot of money, and it's clear that it wouldn't have been spent at that moment in time, but it's maybe not necessarily a revolution, but could rather be called an evolution in the way that Germany addresses its position and role in European security policy. If we briefly look into Belgium, Belgium announced that it's going to go up from 0.9% of GDP in defense budget to 1.54, but that until 2030. Romania already has a defense budget that is above 2,000. It's going to go up a little bit more. Poland wants to go up until 3% of its GDP. Italy and Sweden say as soon as it's practically possible, they also want to attempt the 2%. And the Netherlands says that it will reach the 2% by 24 or 25. So here, really, I think it's important to note that what we observe is at least a willingness to spend much more, but that much more is not necessarily always in new items, but items that were already on the list to being purchased. And not only this, and I will make the point again in just a minute, that money also is spent not only in European military hardware, but also American military hardware. What we also can observe in terms of institutional or membership development on the EU side, a country that was pretty opposed to this common security and defense policy in 1999, Denmark, has now held a referendum on June 1st and has voted in favor of joining the common security and defense policy. So here now we have all EU member states being part of the common security and defense policy. I say that we have to be careful about this because this kind of spending in military equipment happens under a very thin legal background in terms of arms control. So we have the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe's treaty, as well as the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty that have expired a few years ago, and New START, which captures the US and Russian strategic nuclear arsenals, will expire in 2026. And I think it's very unlikely this will be renewed. So there's little legal treaties that actually bind any of these countries to spend more what they want to spend more. And not only this, I mean, we're talking about Russia today, but we can talk about China tomorrow. And I do think that at least the US will also will spend more on its military forces and modernize and increase its military arsenal, given the strategic discussions that are happening in the US right now. So just to keep in mind, there's not much arms control treaties in light of increased military spending. So overall, what can we say on this level? I mean, we observe that lots of instruments on the EU level have been used very fast, right? I mean, in a very flexible manner. Remember, this European Peace Facility had foreseen spending, much less spending in just in a matter of 2 months, and not for Ukraine. So here really we see that the EU has reacted very fast. But one thing, for example, which has not been discussed, even though people like Josep Borrell or Ursula von der Leyen are trying to push in this direction, is we're not changing anything in terms of qualified majority voting when it comes to security and defense matter. At least for the foreseeable future, I doubt this is going to happen. And not only this, but by buying or keep on buying American military equipment, this ambition that France and others in the EU have voiced of strategic autonomy is also being reduced. So what's happening actually on the NATO side? Because when we talk about European security, I think we cannot only look into what's happening in the EU, we also have to look into what NATO is doing. And here the argument is that actually we're seeing a fortification of the Euro-Atlantic area again. So NATO, since the end of the Cold War, had 3 pillars that it was relying on. The one that we know from the Cold War, which is collective defense, but then it also became active in crisis management or out of area operations, as the EU has done as well. And then what NATO calls cooperative security. And cooperative security are all these partnership agreements that you might have heard of. One of them was also with Russia for a while. But so having, well, information exchange in the case of Russia with other countries, also military exercises. And so what we can observe already since 2014 actually is a fortification at the border of the eastern flank of NATO. So various NATO member states have asked for more US presence at the border. And then also NATO has, if again you want to be cynical, has reinforced buffer states like Ukraine by actually training, funding, and helping to reform the Ukraine army since 2014. And this has happened since 2016 under a more cohesive package that's called the Comprehensive Assistance Package. So here we can really observe there was some kind of forward movement at the border, and then some more reinforcement of buffer countries in terms of military. Since 2022, since the illegal invasion of Russia in Ukraine, we now actually observe a much stronger fortification of the eastern flank of NATO, and maybe less support of buffer states, at least visibly so, because anything that NATO is doing visibly outside of its member state is being used by Russia, by Russia's propaganda to say, see, after all, they're quite involved, if not party to the conflict, as good as, right? So here what we now observe is that actually, for the very first time, NATO's Rapid Response Force has been activated. So this means that now there are 40,000 troops within NATO countries which have been always earmarked to fight for NATO purposes, if NATO calls it, but now they're actually on high alert. So they can be called within days to be activated. And this means that actually Sapeur, the high commander of NATO, has as many, I mean, not as many, but many more troops under his command that he had all along the post-Cold War period. And not only this, we have also 8 battle troops that are now being deployed at the eastern flank or the eastern border of NATO, which now means there are troops that are on high alert from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea of NATO territory. So again, I think that speaks a lot to what's happening in terms of fortification of NATO, much a move away from cooperative security, given that anything that is partnership-like, that is about lethal weapons at the moment, is rather done via the EU or bilaterally, of course, and not via NATO. On the national level, what can we observe here? So while Denmark already now has joined or declared and voted in favor of joining the EU CSDP, 2 EU neutral member states who had not been part of NATO but who were partners of NATO have now formally applied to become a member of NATO. That's Finland and Sweden, which will, of course, and I never know these terms properly, so let me please look at my cheat sheet, this would mean if they're actually joining NATO, experts are saying that this will neutralize Russia's anti-access and area denial capabilities in and around Kaliningrad, but in particular actually will maintain the control in and over the Baltic Sea. So many countries in NATO are in favor of having Finland and Sweden join, but there's one country in particular who's using this currently as a leverage for various reasons, right? So Turkey, who people were worried would not play along, but has supported actually NATO's operations, assistance to Ukraine bilaterally. When it comes to the membership discussion of Finland and Sweden, has so far halted this debate by saying that it wants to see certain concessions. So the overall political argument is that Sweden and Finland are supporting the PKK and the Gülen network, and this actually has to change before they can become members. Also, they should reconsider certain sanctions they have towards Turkey when it comes to weapons and weaponry purchases. But at least the reports that I've read, and I am by no means a Turkey expert or know much about Turkey's domestic politics, but let's just say there's general elections happening in Turkey in a year's time from now. There's hyperinflation going on. Erdogan's support is rather slim. And what I've read at least is that people are saying that concessions could be also monetary concessions to buy off political support, but also push some money into the economy. So I leave it at that. I will not be able to answer questions when it comes to this, but at least I think it's not only about the PKK and the Gülen network, but Turkey is also at the moment trying to get, as Erdogan often does, get concessions out of NATO member states for its own domestic purposes.
Yes, and now we're going to take a look again at how all of these decisions and policies that we've been just discussing is reflected in the European public, right? How does the public view NATO and other security-related solutions? So here we utilize data from the same survey, but over a 5-year span. From some countries, we have data from the last 5 years. And just as a summary, before I show you a slide, Russia is increasingly viewed as an enemy, so as a threat that cannot be handled with diplomacy and trade, but should be treated with regard to defense and security concerns. Okay, so it's much more seen as a threat, and that is the most fundamental change from the items we have. There is a 30-point change in comparison to last year, for example. NATO support is generally high over time, but we also see, because of the war, a 10-point increase from 2021 to 2022. The support for the non-existing integrated European army is relatively high, around 60%, but did not further change. And when it comes to the defense budget, so to the real stuff, when it's not just about, yes, we want to be part of NATO, we think it's important, we want to help Ukraine in all kinds of ways, but when it comes to increasing the defense budget, that's really when we see problems and limits. We only see a 7-point rise compared to last year. So really way too small as a reaction given the call for war, weapons, military strength, and all of these announced increases of the budget that are already there. And so we see that as a potential point of friction domestically, that there is not enough willingness to increase the defense budget. So let's look at this more specifically, but I know these small country graphs, I really didn't know about the size of the screen, makes it rather difficult. But again, you can see the green lines here where we see Russia as a threat. You see this rise, particularly, so this is all ordered according to this rise. So Finland, Sweden, the two countries which see the rise in threat most of all, are also the two countries that are applying for NATO membership. But the rise is also there in other countries. It's just not in the countries of the last row where we see a rise, and these countries are historically very close to Russia and don't even now see it as a threat. So other items, again, as I said, NATO is the blue line. It's fairly high. It's just not more important than anything else. For example, the European Army in France and Greece. And we do also see relatively high support for this non-existing army that needs to be integrated, but we see these efforts in this direction, although the army is not there. And finally, the defense budget you see here again with the purple line, and you see that the increases, you know, there's even some countries that decrease importance of the defense budget, but you see increases, but that are relatively small, and they don't really go beyond 30%.
So our third point was, I mean, our third question, it's on. Our third question was about what it does to the liberal order. And here we want to make an argument that actually it has shown how costly it is. The invasion has shown how costly it is to maintain the liberal international global order. And so here we look briefly at the UN. After the invasion, the UN Security Council met in an emergency meeting, but to no surprise, I think, could not come to an agreement given that Russia is a vetoing member of the UN Security Council. But what it could do is that it asked the General Assembly to convene in an emergency meeting itself. And that can be done without a veto, given that it's a procedural measure and not a substantive measure. So the General Assembly met, and on March 2nd, demanded Russia to immediately and completely and unconditionally withdraw all of its military forces from the territory of Ukraine. And so that actually got 441 yeses, 5 noes, and 35 abstentions. And at least talking to friends who shall remain nameless, they told me that to get to this number, 141, a lot of people had to do a lot of phone calls and give a lot of promises, either in terms of political or monetary concessions to get other countries on board. So I think that kind of suggests this is not a very accurate measure of what people actually thought politically of this invasion, but something that actually, in particular, European countries were pushing for, to show that this invasion was not only illegal and legitimate in terms of international law, but also in terms of the international community at large. And we can see that in further resolutions, actually, the support is dwindling already. So these promises cannot be upheld completely. We talk about the other 2 resolutions in just a second. The invasion also has led to a proposal that was made by Liechtenstein. And Liechtenstein is actually a really interesting case at the UN. The ambassador has been there for 23 years, so it's not really on a rotating basis, and is known as one of the historical memories, institutional memories of the UN, given that he has been there long and has also the resources to invite plenty of politicians and diplomats to his residence for a long time. So just to say that it's lots of historical memory. And he has been pursuing a attempt to actually institutionalize that each time the UN Security Council has a veto, the UN General Assembly will actually be able to meet. And that had not passed until April 26th, soon after the invasion. So just to say, we see some kind of mechanisms that are trying to attempt to overcome this veto rights that the Security Council has. But of course, one has to keep in mind that the General Assembly votes are non-binding. So a little different in terms of international law, what's happening in the General Assembly vis-a-vis the UN Security Council. So to say there are some developments procedurally, substantively, Russia has been condemned, but at the same time, that vote does not necessarily reflect a broad agreement with what the EU and the US in particular see as a violation of international law, but has been also to a certain degree, I mean, this is maybe crass to say, been purchased. Not only this, I mean, I think this is also a good reminder that Russia has quite a functioning network globally in different parts of the world, especially on the African continent. I mean, there was a time during the Cold War where the Soviet Union was seen as a liberator from colonial powers. And these networks actually have been, if not maintained, reactivated over the last 10 years already on the African continent. Not only this, African countries also call the EU and European countries hypocritical when it comes to how it has now supported Ukraine vis-a-vis ongoing wars on the African continent. And all of this, I think, feeds into us seeing more divisions that actual vote lets us assume. So if we just briefly look into the other, no, sorry, that is still, so that's, sorry, this is how we can see that was the vote on the first resolution condemning Russia's invasion, where you can see which countries actually voted in favor, which abstained, which were absent, actually, a very interesting category as well, and voted against. And then already the second resolution a few days, no, sorry, not a few days later, but later, that was about Europe, the humanitarian consequences of the aggression. We still see a similar voting pattern, but then when we look at the vote to actually remove Russia from the Human Rights Council, which happened, by the way, but the vote where we've only found 93 countries in favor, 24 against, 58 abstentions. And given that 18 countries were absent, actually just 2/3 majority could still be maintained. And hence Russia was removed from the Human Rights Council, of course, at the very moment announcing that it had the intention of leaving the council anyway, and hence that decision is not really useful. One important thing I think to point out here is that China voted against this decision. So China here already, like many people say, oh, China is not really in favor of this invasion, but I think China is a very benevolent, neutral country in favor of Russian activity. And this might be one indication where we can see that there is some tacit support coming from the Chinese side towards Russia.
So we also wanted to look at global public opinion, how the support looks there, to kind of investigate to what extent the West is here on its own. I mean, before I showed you slides and analyses from European Union countries. So now we go more global, and we found so far, I mean, there must be better data out there, 2 relevant data sources on the report on democracy perceptions from 22. These are the countries that you see in color here that are included. What we want to highlight here, while there is relatively strong support for Ukraine and for its independent status and protection, when it comes to economic ties or also support for economic sanctions, there is much less support outside of the Western world. As you can see here with the different color schemes, more support, cut ties in red and keep ties in green. Throughout all other continents, we see much more support here in keeping the economic ties. And this is just kind of the same, but now analyzed by continents. And as you can see here, that there is quite a division within the global world. However, specific questions about Ukraine, on helping Ukraine, do get relatively strong support. This is from an Ipsos poll, and the composition of the countries is slightly changed here in comparison to the earlier survey. But we do see relatively strong support in the world for specific measures to support Ukraine. And in general, we see also not a complete downfall. We see some sort of punishment, although slight, for Russia. Well, it's kind of Russia is on the negative side of the global survey that I showed you in the beginning, and so is China, although much less so. Whereas the European Union, the United Nations, and the US here as other global powers, if you will, are seen more generally more positively. So that overall scheme has not changed. But when it comes to these particular questions on economic sanctions and ties and sacrifices, we see much more division. Yeah, almost out of time. Yeah, we are out of time. Should we leave that open?
Maybe we leave that question open for discussion and debate.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Excellent, very informative, a lot of topics. So we open now the discussion session. Questions, obviously, but also if you like to bring additional points and not necessarily questions to the panelists. So the floor is open. Okay, we start in the room. I need to ask you to switch on your microphone before you speak.
Hello, my name is Philip Stevens. I'm a visiting fellow. A small provocation, perhaps, in looking at the equivocal support for the Western position on Ukraine in different parts of the world, Africa. You mentioned the Russian network, the residual post-Cold War network being reactivated. And clearly, for lots of nations, there's a question of national self-interest. You know, India, for example, they're moving out of Africa, very close defense ties with Russia, etc. But isn't one of the biggest, and I just wonder whether you've looked at public opinion in the EU or in the West on this, isn't one of the biggest sort of arguments outside of Europe, the hypocrisy one, and isn't the reason it carries force is that it's basically true that Europe's, the EU's reaction in terms of stressing the need to uphold the rule of law, or in its response to acceptance of refugees, has been far more powerful in the instance of Ukraine than it is with regard to conflicts elsewhere in the world. So isn't one of the lessons from this is that Europe has to reflect on the evenness, as it were, of its support for international law and its backing for refugees and those fleeing conflict.
Thank you. Maybe we gather a second question. Dimitri's online.
Hello, can you see me and hear me well?
We can, yes.
Perfect.
Yes.
Thank you so much. My name is Dimitris Kollias. I am a member of the Union of European Federalists. First of all, I would like to thank you for this elaborative presentation. It was an excellent presentation with a lot of charts and examples of what is going on around here in Europe. I was really surprised, especially with some demographics charts, and I find it very interesting. Well, my questions are those. First of all, the first slide that I was able to see was the illegal invasion of Russia. The first question would be, is there any legal invasion when it comes to forced annexation of another sovereign state? And the second question will be, how realistic would you believe that is the discussion about EU defense project when at the same time we have a member state, which is unfortunately Cyprus, under half of the state is under occupation, and the EU borders in the Eastern Mediterranean is under military pressure continually by third countries. So how realistic is the discussion about an EU project about defense, let's say, against third countries? I think this is all for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Further points? So, yeah, go ahead, Marius.
Marius, we can't hear. You need to use the microphone.
Okay, sorry. I hope everyone can hear me now. So basically, I have one question because all the data shows quite nicely the state of affairs, and I was interested if you also measured basically what will be acceptable for various publics when it comes to the definition of victory in Ukraine? How does this end? What would Europeans from different countries consider to be an acceptable outcome if you measure this? Because that will be interesting. I think that once we get in the later parts of this conflict, we may find ourselves in the midst of conflicting understandings of what is an acceptable end to the conflict.
Bridget?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for a great set of issues that were raised. Can I ask about the long-term impact against the backdrop of great power competition? Because obviously, for the United States, China remains its #1 geopolitical concern, but it's been drawn back pretty dramatically into the European theatre and the Euro-Atlantic Alliance, NATO. So, first question, will Europe be asked to, to support the US, or will it be under pressure to support the US in its view of future relations with China, rather more than it would have been without the invasion of Ukraine? And then secondly, is this likely to drive further potential decoupling of globalization between, in other words, could we see the emergence of more economic rival blocs? I'm not talking about total decoupling, but rather more partial decoupling and the impact the war in Ukraine will have on that. But thanks for a great presentation.
Thank you, Bridget. I don't know if you would like to react to some of these points, or if we move on, because there are other.
I want to reflect on a few comments here on the hypocrisy one, which is obvious that in this particular conflict, the European public, as well as the European politicians, have been particularly open, especially with this SWIFT package that we talked about, the temporary measures of the refugees status. But also the European public is particularly supportive. And so, of course, we could kind of write it off to racist attitudes. I mean, that would be one way of doing it, and saying that there was much more concern about integration, cultural roots, but potentially also security concerns, whatever, when we talked about refugees from other countries and Syria. But I'm not sure that we should do that. I mean, there is psychological theory tells us that we care more about everything that is closer to us and everyone that is geographically and culturally closer to us. So yes, I mean, there is this fine line between this understanding and racism. I think you were really much more concerned about the equal application of the law in that case, right? And how countries react policy-wise and regard these conflicts. So I think with that regard, we have to say that there is certainly catch up to do, and some sort of reflection needs to happen, but it is very understandable that countries that feel threatened, and we can show this threat perception through some of our questions, will react stronger here and potentially more forcefully than if they are not personally threatened. That would be my first overall reaction, but certainly there should be cause for concern. I think with the second question by Dimitri, we were quite not sure about the second part of the question, so we'll come back to that. What do people accept as acceptable outcomes? Well, first of all, I think we should let Ukraine decide. I think that's the most important, that we shouldn't really pay too close attention to what European publics accept in this case. This is really important also for politicians to point out that this is Ukraine's decision. So I think that's the number one outcome. But I think that there is a consensus also amongst Ukraine scholars emerging that one of the acceptable outcomes would be to come back to the borders of the pre-war borders. So basically, which would mean a sacrifice of Crimea and some parts of Eastern Ukraine. So there is some discussion about it. There's not an agreement, but that would be an acceptable outcome is discussed. To what extent the European public is really behind it, we of course don't know. We don't have these questions, but I also think we shouldn't really care too much about it. And yeah, I think I leave the rest to you.
So very briefly, Philip, right? If I understood, yeah. Yeah, I think hypocrisy has been winning for a very long time, not just with Ukraine, in the sense that these different interventions have always been very selective, right? So, I mean, I think European, like the West, the US, Europe are relatively maybe consistent in condemning human rights violations and breaches of international law, but they're very selective in the way they then, where they put capacities to then react to these to these breaches. So in that sense, and I think Russia was really good in pointing this out over a long period of time. I mean, there's like, I have a postdoc, Anna Burai, who works on the parody of norm violations and how Russia is using a discourse that the EU has used for invasion and vice versa. So in that sense, I do think this is happening quite a bit. Dimitris, I am no international lawyer, but as far as I know, the UN Charter says there are two ways where you can legally use force, and that's self-defense, and when the UN Security Council tells you so. So yes, that was an illegal invasion, but I think we put it in the slide just to remind ourselves too that this is not a war that Ukraine has chosen, but it's a war that has been imposed on them. And so I think that was just the signaling that we intended with this particular slide. I'm not so sure I understood your second question about how realistic it is to have a common security and defense policy given that Cyprus is occupied. I mean, we have this policy even, I mean, Cyprus joined in 2004. The assumption was it will be unified by that time. That of course failed, not necessarily because, well, that was a Cypriot decision, not a Northern Cypriot decision. But so what did you mean by that?
Okay, so could you please allow me to come back to this question? I mean that there is a lot of discussion about the creation of the European Army, which was a discussion of the old days of the European Union, and it comes back when it comes to the defense against the Russian aggression. The question was aimed to take some comment from you in order to understand if you believe that it's quite realistic for Europe to have its own military forces in order to protect its borders and not to wait only from NATO and its forces to protect the European borders. As concerned the Cyprus and the entrance of Cyprus in the European Union, I don't think that there is any legal acknowledge of the Northern Cyprus as a sovereign state. So I think that Cyprus is always a sovereign state as it is. So yes.
Yeah, completely. I just thought you linked this to whether the EU will build up this capacity. Sorry, that then I misunderstood. So yeah, I mean, I don't think there ever will be a European army, as there is no NATO army, by the way, either. So I mean, no, there is no fully integrated supranational military force. I mean, NATO has an integrated command structure of a size that the EU doesn't have, but even the EU is slowly building up headquarters structures. I mean, ever since the UK left the EU, the UK was one of the big blockers of building more headquarters structures. I'm sorry, I mean, I don't want to bore people too much with these details, but there used to be only national headquarters that could be multinationalized and used for EU purposes, 5 of them. And now there's also, there used to be a tiny operation center, 8-9 people in the EU, and now that has been upgraded quite a bit, and that was actually possible through Brexit. So in that sense, we're building up some kind of structures that can coordinate military actions both on the national level and on the EU level. But this EU army is something that Macron, even Merkel in the parliament has used a few times, but has never defined. And I think if you would ask them to define it, they would not say that it's a supranationalized, fully integrated military force on the EU level, but they mean some kind of what already exists, military operations where soldiers from EU member states have their national flag, but also an EU badge on their arm, right? Instead of a UN badge, for example, is my assumption, but I have not asked them, I had no chance to. Marius, I'm just gonna add one question to your question, because I'd be very curious to see how this develops over time. I mean, my fear is that there's gonna be lots of fatigue in certain publics. I think that some publics will be more and more pursuing a no compromise solution, and other publics in other countries will actually be less enthusiastic than they are now. May it be about supporting Ukraine or having Ukraine become a member of the European Union, which is also pretty high right now, but I'm not so sure. And Bridget, oh, if I wish I could answer this question with gusto and lots of information, but the only thing I can say, right, completely, as you said, like the US had this strategy of the Asia pivot for quite a while. And ever since they announced the Asia pivot, the EU has been, or European countries, or the European continent and the affairs that are happening there have been keeping the US forces here. And the US even has moved forces back to Europe that had it initially sent back to the US. So all I can say here is that I think we see moderate support of the EU and European countries already, right? I mean, the EU, but France, the UK, they have Indo-Pacific strategies now because they realize their economic interests are also at heart. So they're more and more focusing also to a certain degree militarily in the Indo-Pacific. And so that's on the more military security side. And then in terms of decoupling and global supply chains, that's really not my topic, but I'm just going to say, I think Abe Newman and Henry Farrell would say, yes, weaponized interdependence is a thing. The US has lots of powers in readjusting the network. And maybe this is what we see going on right now, but I would not want to say how, because I don't know, sorry.
Okay, thank you. We have now another round of comments. We start in the room, then go to Calypso online, and then we come back to the room.
Yeah, hello. Thanks a lot for the presentation. Sandra Destradi, visiting fellow here. So I have a comment or maybe a suggestion. I would be really curious to see whether on the explanation side at the beginning of your presentation, whether it matters if these countries have populist governments or populists, really being prevalent in the political landscape in a way, because of course the question would be whether this is part of a broader realignment and critique of the liberal order coming from within. And I mean, we know those debates, so I think it would be really interesting. And my second question, or my proper question, would be on maybe on the future and on rethinking defense in Europe. To what extent is in the EU the potential outcome of the elections, of the next elections in the US being discussed? I mean, we've seen the disproportionate role the US is playing in this, and we all know what might happen if it turns in a different way. So is the EU really discussing this seriously? Yeah, that would be my question. Thank you.
Calypso. Here she is.
Yes, thank you for a great presentation. So rich. I have three quick questions. I too wanted to come back into your initial explanations of variations in public opinion. So specifically to ask, what are the kind of those that are likely to remain and be sustained, specifically, for instance, the dependence on gas. And because we're seeing that this is changing faster than we thought, so that energy policies, especially national energy policies, are becoming kind of important intervening variables. But in your dependent variable, gas seems to explain overall how public opinion reacts, but how about how they will react specifically to decoupling with Russia, given their dependence, so react on that specific outcome, and what is can you get at that more specifically? Because this is probably what is going to stay with us most heavily. Second question is indeed on the EU army, the eternal EU army, and fascinating that you find that the war doesn't change very much on this. So I was wondering, to what extent do you think your data supports, further differentiated integration in CSDP? And moreover, there is also this data contrasting support for European army and support for increased national budget. And I think we spoke about this last time, but the reversion to the national flag versus the European flag on defense, or is it a different national flag? That was a fascinating question, and I wonder if your data gets at that difference. But how to explain the kind of stickiness of public opinion there is fascinating. And third question, rebounding again on Philip's question and the hypocrisy debate, etc. The data there, I wonder, I believe and hope that we're going to have much more differentiated debate on public opinions and how they feel about double standards and ex post facto versus ex ante. I mean, in part because I've argued in the past that, there is a one voice mantra in the EU, but actually so often it's better to use the comparative advantage of different countries. And so I think when Europe starts to think very hard about this problem of perception by the global South, different member states will have different roles to play. And it would be interesting to know if they're backed up by their public opinion. Now, I know you haven't done that differentiation, but would you see how to do it in the future to help us in the kind of more prescriptive side?
Thank you, Calypso. Gary.
Can you hear me? Shall I raise my voice? Because I have microphone distance here. I just have a comment, already a question about the hypocrisy debate. Putting aside the refugees for the moment, let's think about the war itself, the invasion itself. Let me frame this as a question. Can you think of other examples in which, since World War II, in which a great power actually intends, aggrandizes another country to encompass that within its own territory? It sounds very 19th century. It sounds like I'm talking about Napoleon and North Italy, or parts of Belgium, or the greater Third Reich. So I'm not talking about something that looks like a grenade. I'm not talking about something, I can see the difference between that and say the counter invasion of Iraq or Afghanistan. I don't think in those cases you might say, well, we were aggrandizing oil resources, but to actually try to swallow at least a legally independent country, that I don't see. But there may be examples that I'm missing. A great power affecting to eliminate, to swallow, to encompass a legally independent country.
Thank you. So yeah, maybe we take another question from the audience.
Thank you. I'm Jan Lepeu, SPS researcher here working on sanctions. I was really fascinated by the polls on the EU views, the public views in the EU on the war and everything. And I thought, in a sense, you don't underline like the main finding, which is a bit self-evident, which is that like there is no divide between Western Europe and CEE countries and Central and Eastern European countries when it comes to views on Russia and what to do about the invasion. And I think like I kind of felt that for a while now, but I think like when you read the press, you often like miss this point, because we often tend to have this kind of old divide between new Europe, old Europe that comes back to 2003 and other moments. And I think, I really think like it's an information that should be put out there like quite forcefully, because I think in a sense, like now that we stop the Western explaining, we have like a tendency to just like treat them as all the same countries. And maybe we should say like Northern, Central and Eastern European countries rather than CEE countries, because I think like often what we mean by that is actually Poland and the 3 Baltic states.
And yes, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I'm Simona Tollens. I'm also a visiting fellow here. First of all, I just wanted to say about perhaps your question. I wonder if we could, however, still consider it as a form of regime change, right? So did Russia really want to annex and fully encompass that territory, or was it a regime change? Because if that's the case, I think we may have several comparable cases, but open for discussion. No, just the questions about sort of, I guess, your sort of continuity and change story or narratives or sort of, you know, and I'm not entirely sure where you land on this, but I wanted to just ask you about sort of, in your opinion, what kind of really radical changes are we seeing? Because most of the measures and developments you describe are upgrading of existing measures. And as Stephanie said as well, in terms of, for example, this at the EU level, the most noteworthy perhaps sort of action is an active, I know I'm a bit biased, but you know, active delivery of security assistance, very, very sort of publicly, you know, broadcast. Now, but this instrument existed before. And so, you know, it is, I think, a dramatic measure, and it's in many ways. But I wondered exactly in terms of those tangible, hard, radical, new instruments. And I don't know, maybe also your reflections in terms of the rewriting, essentially, of the strategic compass. Could we find some elements or some indicators or indications about sort of where this potential radical change is going if we look into the rewriting of the security strategy, so the strategic compass? That was a draft already in December, but that was, you know, passed at the peak of all of this happening. And in my own reading of that, for example, what the EU is seeing is Russia everywhere. It is seeing Russia in all kinds of theaters, and the response will be to counter that, sort of, you know, globalizing security scapes in kind of somehow unprecedented ways. So just throwing that out there. Thanks.
Thank you.
I think that was I think your point is a good one. I think it was, if you look at Putin's writings, I think it was a regime change. He wanted to change the regime to that of Russia. I think it was annexation. I think the goal was annexation. I think it would have, maybe it would have taken time. Who knows? Who knows? So I think it is a, you know, that would be the kind of the debate. I think you framed it. You know, was annexation the goal, the ultimate goal, or was it an attempt to change the regime? And I think in Putin's mind, the two are very deeply connected. But you know, it's a debate. But I think it's an important one.
No, I think it is quite comparable to other cases and the 2003 invasion of Iraq. It is a direct regime change. It is about bringing Iraq into the fold of, and it was also where there was real belief in a Western liberal order. So it was about doing this with force. There was a great optimism in that sort of thought. So, but whether sort of what is the actual, maybe we can link this in terms of what was the actual initial objective of Putin. And this is really not my expertise, but I would link it perhaps into the continuity and change question that I had, because what we are looking at right now, and of course your opinion poll data is from April 2022, right? The last bit, which is again a particularly peak moment. And I wonder, of course, have there been changes now? Because what we are seeing now is, of course, that the situation has kind of localized. We are back to an enlarged to 2014 status quo, where the fighting has been concentrated in the Donbass, in the eastern area, where Crimea is now lost. But you know, and so the debates are shifting, and you know, what are we likely to go back into? You know, a normalization essentially. So yeah, just putting it.
Sandra?
Yeah, just a very small addition on the debate you just had. And as somebody working on the Global South, I think from the Global South perspective, this is all about sovereignty, violations of sovereignty. And from their perspectives, like there are many of those violations. So, okay, not full-fledged annexation, but all the things China is doing at its borders, all the contested borders here and there. This is what it's being compared with. And my timeline on Twitter is full of Indian colleagues saying, well, don't drag us into your European problems. We're having this kind of things here all the time. So I think it really matters, to better understand how they see it and understand it, right? So objectively, it might be different, but it's seen as something, like very common in other parts of the world in a way, which is strange, but I think we should take it seriously.
So back to the panelists.
I have lots of answers, but we don't have much time. So I want to respond to that comparison that you're trying to make with the Iraq invasion, which I think cannot be done. and the reason is that this war goes hand in hand with the genocide. It goes hand in hand with a non-recognition of the existence of that country, with an eradication of its history in books and school education, language. So there are all kinds of attempts. I'm not saying it has not happened in other places in the world. There have been genocides and examples of that. But I think to compare this with the Iraq war in 2003 is really stretching on how far this war is going. So that was my first reaction. I have several more. I don't know how we want to divide. You want to start maybe? No, we'll go ahead. Maybe you and I.
Yeah, select and.
Yeah. I can add later. Oh, no, you want to respond, right? No.
Please look again at the microphone.
Oh, I'm not getting used to that.
So a few reactions. So for me, like Sandra, Simone, and Gary, what you said is super interesting. And I think these things operate maybe also on different kind of levels. I mean, Gary, you mentioned great powers, right? So by definition, you already talk more about global implications, geopolitical implications of a particular invasion. It's not just only the humanitarian consequences, for example, that all military invasions imply killing of innocent people, civilians, etc., and displacement of people internally and externally. So I think so different countries make different arguments on these levels, like global or regional implications, say for India, for example, maybe not global aspirations right now, but contestation of borders and annexation, etc. And then again, humanitarian. And so for me, I'm not sure on which level we will argue to say what the implications are, because I think African states, for example, their argument is not about geopolitical consequences of an invasion, but it's all about the humanitarian consequences. And they say on our continent, people are being killed, and the EU is doing much less when it comes to that than when at their immediate border something is happening. And so the geopolitical aspect of that invasion it's not being talked about in the same terms. So the African Union, for example, condemned certain aspects of the EU, I mean, in an official statement. So just that would be my 2 cents on this. So of course now, Jan's point, well taken. There's a political alignments and reconfiguration, especially when it comes to Russia. And Simone, yeah, I mean, I think this was my point without making the point explicitly, that we don't observe as radical changes as we could have maybe expected, or the way that I read the media makes it sound to be. But that, I mean, of course, the radical changes are the speed. I mean, who thinks of the EU as being a very flexible and fast reacting organization? Maybe that is one of the radical changes, that it showed that it's an organization who can, at least to a certain degree, right? I mean, the measures it does, it's still on a small scale compared to, say, what the US is doing, for example. But in that sense, that to me is quite a change. Germany, again, I wasn't as surprised as others maybe about the speech and the commitment, because of promises that have been made and the debates that have happened in the Bundestag before, but that it happened at the time and with most parties in agreement, because they needed 2/3 majority in the Bundestag, and that's what they got. So in that sense, yeah, these are the major shifts for me. But for me, I'm not sure I would mention the strategic compass, but that also shows that I've read it a while ago and don't remember it so well. So I should do it again. But I remember we had the discussion here, right, at Schuman, one of Borrell's advisors was here saying, well, we have to redraft the compass now. And that to me is like the shift here is maybe more about this temporary halting of West's planning, in the sense of that Central and Eastern European countries or the Baltics and Poland are much more listened to for now within the European Union in the security apparatus than they have been before. They have been dismissed, and I think that might be a radical shift, but I'm not sure how temporary that is, because that's not institutionalized, right? Maybe France and Germany will take hold of this issue area again, and then I don't know how the document, the next document will read. But I can totally see that. Yes, I leave it for now because I'm also hungry.
Should I? Or yeah, I think these were just great comments. So I don't want to let it drag on for too long. But I think the populist governments, I don't know who said it, but yeah, I think that is a very good suggestion. It matters particularly when they are in government. When they are not in government, they are dragging down the country's overall support, and there might be internal debates, and it might be problematic when they come into government. But when they are in government, as we see with Hungary, for example, there is definitely much less support overall. Whether the change in the US, potential change in government in the US has been discussed in Europe. It has totally been discussed, especially with regard to NATO membership in Sweden and Finland, for example. It was one of the main points, not the only ones, but one of the main points of the counter debate. What if we are then dependent on a very non-predictable US government that might drag us down a completely different loophole that we don't want to go into. So I think there is a lot of worry, but I think when they weigh this against the threat from Russia, they still decided the threat is bigger, but the worries are there. So whether Europe has organized itself against that or protected itself, I think is still an open question. There's lots of other, I think also the division within Europe, that it's not West and East against each other, but here we see really more divisions within the East and some Western countries such as Greece, and I've been talking with Elias about this, like a new alliance based on old ties to Russia that might divide the unity of Europe as a new kind of division that we have to watch out for. And I think that is something fundamental that divides Eastern European countries very much against each other, particularly with regard to their location, but not only, also to their historical ties. We don't see a radical change in public opinion either. We don't really see, I was expecting many more ruptures in our data. Luckily, we had this data over 5 years and asking some of the same questions. And I was surprised to see much more continuity. Only the Russian threat that really stands out there as a perception that has definitely increased. And that is surprising, but visually we see a certain mobilization in each country with protests and real like personal actions, that people undertake to do something for Ukraine. So there is a momentum there, also Calypso, for integration. We just don't see it yet in the data. And that could be because maybe it needs a while to sink in, or it's also that politics is a little far removed from everybody. So we don't really see it in the way we ask the questions. So something to look into in the future. Thank you for all your comments.
Thank you. Thank you for your input presentation. Thank you everyone for your contribution. I think it has been a very informative and thought-provoking, unsettling session, obviously, given the circumstances. So we have 3 sessions left in the series. We have one session on the impact on EU migration policy, so a very important session too, and one on EU enlargement, and by Bridget, who is with us also today. But next week we have a bit of special session on core state powers by the EU, and I think it's a session that we should have had at the end of the series, but for logistic reasons we couldn't. And it tries to put a bit everything together, and answering the question that I always ask at the end of these sessions is, what do you think? Is this more Europe in this area? Is it less Europe? Do you think the impact of the war has accelerated integration, or has not had that much impact? What would be your very short assessment?
For me, yes, more I mean, more capacity, same political will.
I would say it's a different Europe. It's not the same. It's a differently divided Europe. And there are other obstacles now that we need to watch out for. But I see also glimpses of enthusiasm to come together on this issue.
Okay, thank you. So I hope to see many of you also next week. Remember that the previous sessions on finance, on energy, and on European identity and politics can be watched on our website in case someone missed them. Thank you very much and goodbye.